co-written 8 books related to the UFO phenomenon. He holds a bachelor's degree in English and a master's in library science from the University of Texas at Austin. And now, please welcome Noe Torres.
Thank you very much. Just a quick correction on that intro. I had written some notes about, to introduce this talk when I gave it at Presidio a couple of weeks ago. We had a UFO conference at Presidio. And so it was, the incident happened about 40 miles from where we sat that day in Presidio when we were doing the talk there. So this actually occurred on the Texas-Mexico border near Presidio, Texas, in the Big Bend country. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. UFO crash near the Texas-Mexico border. All right, we're going to get started here. We had the, and I apologize, one of our screens has gone out, so I'm going to, if you need to sit over on this side of the room, we're going to be using this screen on the right. We had the privilege to work with Bill Burns and the crew from the UFO Hunters TV show a couple of years ago on the History Channel. And I'm just going to play this neat little introduction that they did when they did a story about our book. And here it is from the UFO Hunters.
What you are about to see is case number 74012, UFO crash and retrieval.
So we went down to Presidio, Texas, and then we crossed over into OJ, as it's known by the locals, Ojinaga, Chihuahua. And then we went about 50 miles beyond Ojinaga into Mexico to the small village of Coyame. And, in 1974, when this incident happened, and as it is today, Coyame is a very small town, just several hundred people live there. But where the incident happened was actually approximately 60 to 70 miles northeast of Coyame. So it really didn't happen there in that small town. Anyway, we went down there with the team, and we had a really good experience talking to people in the area and eyewitnesses and so forth. So it was an interesting time. But I'm going to back up now and tell you how the whole Mexico's Roswell incident unfolded. And I thought rather than me talking for 20 minutes, there's this really nice video that was put together on an earlier show by the History Channel. And I'm going to show you kind of a summary of the case, very brief, in about 5 minutes in this nice video. And here we go.
August 25th, 1974. Coyame, Mexico is home to its own mysterious, some say lethal UFO incident. It is a place not found on many maps, and is home to more agave plants than people. But several of those who do live here claim the following event is real. It's a quiet summer's night in Coyame. The town's inhabitants are beginning to turn in for the night. 500 miles away, United States air defense systems suddenly register an unknown object flying over the Gulf of Mexico, streaking across the sky at over 2,500 miles per hour at an altitude of 75,000 feet. Only one thing is for certain. This is not something man-made. Initial indications are that it's probably nothing more than a meteor. But 60 seconds later, it becomes clear that's impossible.
This object was traveling and descending through steps, unlike that of a meteor, again, that was more of an arc.
The object appears headed on a course towards Corpus Christi, Texas. American air defense systems are alerted. Suddenly, the unidentified flying object veers left and enters Mexican airspace just 40 miles south of Brownsville, Texas. The U.S. continues tracking the puzzling spacecraft as it now races over Mexico. What isn't seen on radar is a small craft headed on a trajectory towards the UFO.
What's also interesting about this case is about the same time as this UFO was zigging and zagging, there was a plane that was leaving El Paso headed towards Mexico City.
A small civilian plane from El Paso heads towards Mexico's capital city, but never reaches its destination. At the same time, the American military watches as their unidentified flying object disappears from radar. It appears that the unthinkable has happened.
There's an assumption that there was a collision of some type where both the craft and the plane had collided.
The following morning, 9 hours after the civilian plane disappeared over the desert, a Mexican recovery team hunts for the downed craft. Across the border, American intelligence listens in. The Americans intercept a Mexican military radio report. The wreckage of the missing plane has been spotted just outside Coyame. Moments later, another report shockingly announces the sighting of a second wreck. But this is no plane.
The Mexican recovery team finds a sort of a silver-shaped classic disc, some 16 feet 5 inches, about 5 feet thick, convex on both sides, sort of like a saucer.
The saucer's surface has the appearance of polished steel. It has no markings, no lights, and there are no bodies inside. However, it does appear to be damaged in 2 spots, possibly caused by a collision with a civilian plane, and then falling to the ground. Immediately, Mexican officials declare radio silence on all search activities. Meanwhile, U.S. officials reach out to the Mexican government, offering assistance in the recovery. Their offer is met with a denial.
The Mexican government denied it. They said, no, all we have is just a plane wreckage.
While the Mexican team collects the crash debris, the United States is busy assembling their own elite recovery force at Fort Bliss, Texas. The team includes 4 helicopters, 3 small Hueys, and a large Sea Stallion. The team is placed on standby while U.S. surveillance scopes out the situation.
The U.S. was keeping tabs again through its spy, well, what I call the spy surveillance network, through their satellite surveillance as well as airplanes that were flying over at low altitude.
American surveillance reveals that the Mexicans have placed the UFO on a flatbed truck and moved from the crash site. Then some say satellite photos were taken that reveal a startling discovery. The Mexican convoy has stopped, and something has gone wrong.
They were able to see there were a number of dead bodies, so which led them to believe that something extraordinary had happened.
U.S. officials greenlight their rescue team. 4 helicopters depart Fort Bliss.
One of the things that seems obvious in this case is that the government, the U.S. government, responded very expertly, very quickly, and very organized. They had this team that assembled in Fort Bliss, and in no time were down there on site recovering this. They've done this before.
But nothing will prepare the Americans for what they are about to find. Dressed in bioprotection suits, the American soldiers approach the silent convoy and find all the Mexicans dead. There is no time to investigate what killed the Mexican team, but UFO researchers have their theories.
They somehow came in contact with a lethal agent, a bacteriological agent that was from out of this world, or an extraterrestrial biological agent of some sort that killed them, which is my favorite theory.
The U.S. recovery team quickly tends to business. It finds the 16-foot wide silver UFO strapped to the back of a flatbed truck. The straps are reconfigured and connected to a cargo cable from the Sea Stallion helicopter. Safely secured, the estimated 1,500-pound disc is lifted up and headed back to the U.S. With the saucer gone, the team immediately turns their attention to the remaining evidence. The plane wreckage, vehicles from the convoy, and Mexican teen bodies are gathered.
They gathered the debris, the bodies from the Mexican recovery team, and then they exploded them with high explosives. The reason why is to hide the evidence.
Their work done, the recovery team heads back to base. Where the UFO was taken is unknown. Some have speculated Atlanta, Fort Bliss, or Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. If this 1974 UFO crash was real, there was no evidence to prove it.
Okay, a very interesting case that I first ran across in 2005. I was doing a book about famous UFO cases in Texas. And one of the cases that crossed my radar screen at that time was this report of an object sighted off the coast of Brownsville and coming in from the Gulf of Mexico, going over 2,500 miles per hour at an altitude of over 75,000 feet. And it ended up crashing with a small plane in the Big Bend country near Presidio, Texas. So that was a story as I first heard it. When I was planning to include it as a chapter in a larger book about famous UFO cases in the state of Texas. But as I found out more and more information about it, and as I contacted the gentleman that you saw several times being interviewed in that History Channel documentary, Ruben Uriarte, a California UFO researcher who's the head of MUFON in Northern California. When I connected with him, he had a lot more data, and he had talked to witnesses and so forth. So it ended up being that we had so much material on this one case that I dropped all the other cases that were going to go in the book, and we just did this one UFO case for the whole book. And the book came to be called Mexico's Roswell. And for those of you, I think most of you are probably familiar with the original Roswell case in 1947, where craft came down about 100 miles north of Roswell, 50 to 100 miles north of Roswell, New Mexico. It was recovered by the U.S. military. There were many people in Roswell working at the Roswell Army Airfield who saw bodies, who saw the crashed object. Well, this has similarities to that case. Interestingly enough, it happened in 1974, this particular case. So it happened, 30-some years after the Roswell incident in New Mexico. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down what happened in this case and then give you some additional information that we found out. Also, the subtitle of my case today is New Witnesses. We just recently had a UFO conference, as I mentioned, in Presidio, Texas, which is the closest populated place on the Texas side to where this happened. The closest place on the Mexican side would be OJ, or Ojinaga, across the bridge, International Bridge from Presidio. And in connection with having the UFO Festival in Presidio, which, by the way, was organized by a fine gentleman that we call Brad in Black, Brad Newton. Take a bow there, Brad. We had a wonderful event. And I'm going to ask Brad at the last part of my lecture, right at the end, I'm going to have him come up and talk a little bit about how the UFO conference was received in Presidio. And it really brought the community together, and it was a great PR. The UFO Festival in Presidio appeared on the front page of the San Antonio Express News the next day. So, I mean, this was tremendous publicity for the Big Bend area, Presidio, Marfa. And it's by the way, it's one of the most beautiful places to visit in the state of Texas. And my family and I frequently vacationed there even before we found out about this case. Anyway, taking you back in time to 1974, it was 10 o'clock in the evening when all of a sudden the radar screens at several U.S. military installations along the Texas Gulf Coast suddenly lit up with an incoming object that was coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. And it was headed apparently toward Corpus Christi when it was first spotted. As I mentioned earlier, it was going extremely fast, over 2,500 miles per hour at an altitude of over 75,000 feet, and seemed to be headed toward the coast of Texas, important port city, of course. Well, suddenly the object slowed to under 2,000 feet, dropped to 45,000 feet, slowed to under 2,000 miles per hour and dropped to 45,000 feet, and then came straight down, did about a 90-degree angle turn to the south, and then did another 90-degree angle turn into northern Mexico, about 40 miles south of Brownsville, Texas. So that's near the mouth of the Rio Grande River right down here, where the Rio Grande River empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And just 40 miles south of there is where this supposedly entered Mexican airspace. All right, so then this craft zoomed across the northern part of Mexico. Many people have looked at this map and have noticed that the trajectory of the object took it away from any major population centers. It stayed pretty much over sparsely populated areas. And it kind of followed more or less the course of the Rio Grande River. Here's the Rio Grande. It came zooming across northern Mexico. This is an area, by the way, known as the Zona del Silencio. Has anybody heard of the Zona del Silencio? Strange stuff happens in the zona. Compasses spin wildly. Radio equipment doesn't function. Instrument panels on board aircraft experience electrical problems. There are magnetic anomalies. There are frequent UFO sightings, all in this area of Mexico, right around here and extending into the U.S. around Presidio Marfa. How many of you have heard of the Marfa Lights? You were here for Ismael's presentation a few minutes ago. He showed some videos, talked about it a little bit. That's all in this anomalous zone very close to Mexico's Zona del Silencio. So not only is it a great area for tourism, but it has many mysterious qualities to it. People, actually, researchers come from all over the world to visit the Big Bend area and to go experience the Marfa Lights and other anomalous zones such as Zona del Silencio. So anyway, this object was streaking across the sky and it got right about to where the zona is located. And then something strange happened. A small plane had taken off about an hour before from El Paso International Airport, headed south toward Mexico City. It was a plane that was a Mexican registry, and it was headed once again from El Paso. Now, we've talked to pilots and they tell us it's typical for them to take this flight path along the Rio Grande down toward the Coyame area, toward Ojinaga, and then on south toward Mexico City. Well, it was a small plane that apparently collided in midair with this UFO. And the collision occurred right here at about 10:30 p.m. Texas time, as you can see, as indicated by the two arrows coming together and the crash site. The two radar blips became one. In the municipio of Coyame. Now the municipio is like a county, and the municipio de Coyame is a very large area land-wise, but there's not many people living there. There's mainly ranches with livestock, and very few people actually live out there. Ruben and I have been all around here conducting research. We went by ourselves a couple of times, then we went with the History Channel and a film crew. And so we've seen everything from the Mexican side. We've talked to people who were living there in the 70s when this occurred. And we had gotten a number of people who remembered something very strange happening in '74, but we had never heard from anyone on the Texas side. You know, we figured that there had to have been somebody on the Texas side who might have seen something, especially in the Presidio, Rio Dosa area, just right across the bridge. So actually what happened is, because of the UFO festival, some witnesses came forward that were standing on the Texas side of the international boundary, looking into Mexico when this happened, and saw an incredible sight. And I'm going to show you their video testimony in a few moments. So this UFO and airplane supposedly, had a mid-air collision, then the two objects went down to the desert floor below, in an area which Ruben Uriarte, my co-author, and I have been to several times, called El Llano. Now, Brad, you've been on a plane overflying El Llano, or just flying over from the Texas side. And so, you know, it's a very flat part there. As in Spanish, the term El Llano means flat or plain, a plain area. And that's exactly into that area is where the remnants of the two craft went down. Just to show it to you on a map, down here is Presidio and OJ, Ojinaga, down in here. Then up here is Candelaria and Rio Dosas around here, Candelaria, and right across in this yellow shaded area is where we feel that the crash, the mid-air collision and subsequent recovery effort took place. It's a satellite map. As you can see, it's a very rugged area. Here's the Rio Grande River. You can trace it out right in here, kind of a yellow line. And it's hard to see here, but Rio Dosa's up here. I'm sorry, Candelaria's up here. And so that's the general area we're talking about. And this right here is the El Llano. So the Mexican soldiers arrived, as you saw in the video, they arrived and they found this disc lying on the ground, fairly intact. It had some damage points, but it had fairly well survived the collision. The plane, on the other hand, was basically obliterated. So it was described as a metal disc about 16 feet, 5 inches in diameter, with no windows or doors, about 5 feet tall and convex, and slightly damaged at 2 points. Now what's interesting is that 9 months after this happened, there was another small plane heading toward Mexico City that was surrounded by 4 small discs, just like this. Virtually, the description of the witness, the pilot, was virtually identical to this description. It happened 9 months later. The 4 UFOs surrounded his small plane, and I've heard the transmission of him talking to the aircraft controllers in Mexico City, where he's saying, "Mayday, Mayday, I'm surrounded by UFOs. My instrument panel does not work. What do you advise?" And you know, actually, one of the UFOs went underneath the plane, and he felt a jarring impact when it hit the bottom of the plane. His instrument panel had gone completely out, and he was apparently being steered by the UFOs that had surrounded the plane. So that happened 9 months after this, and what's uncanny is that he also described them as small silver discs about 16 feet in diameter. So it's an amazing coincidence that these two events happened in around the same period at the same time. So supposedly, what happened next then was the U.S., our research indicates that the U.S. has various military personnel always on call in the event that something like this happens, and they get assembled very quickly at a staging area, and they get shipped off to quarantine the area and make the recovery. So supposedly the area where they were assembled was Fort Bliss in El Paso, which is one of the largest military compounds in the country. It extends from the El Paso area on into New Mexico. And there's vast stretches of federally owned land in that area. So Fort Bliss was said to be the staging area. The helicopter convoy then went down, followed the Rio Grande on the Texas side, and then when they got to the Candelaria area, they crossed over into Mexico to make the crash recovery. Now what's very interesting is this case has been out there, really out in front of the public since about 2005, when my co-author Ruben Uriarte and I started releasing information about it, talking about it on Coast to Coast and the History Channel and so forth. And all of a sudden, about 2 or 3 months ago, with the Presidio UFO festival coming up, suddenly somebody makes an anonymous posting to Wikipedia. That's the online encyclopedia where anybody can go in and contribute information. And we had never had any names of the soldiers who were involved in this incident, but suddenly some names were posted, and we're doing a lot of background checking to see who might have put this information, because there seems to be, it sounds authoritative, but we're still doing research on this because, this is a very recent development. If you go to the Wikipedia and look up Koyame, UFO, C-O-Y-A-M-E, you'll get this description. It says, at the U.S. military radar air base, 4 Huey helicopters were readied up, as well as a 15-man recovery team to head to Koyame, Mexico. The American group included Captain Lawrence Murley, Lieutenant Randall Bishop, Lieutenant Eduardo Ramirez, Lieutenant Benjamin Rhodes, Sergeant Terrence Miles, and Lieutenant Jeremy Smith, all retired U.S. Army Forces personnel. Now, that's funny that it says retired. We don't know if they mean they're retired now and they were active back then, or whether retired personnel were used to make this recovery. So the group entered Mexico surreptitiously after interception of a Mexican radio communication giving away the location of the crash site. So once again, this is totally unconfirmed. It just suddenly appeared on Wikipedia about 2 months ago. And we're still trying to backtrack and find out whether that can be considered credible or not. So the Mexican soldiers arrived first. They beat the U.S. team to the crash site. They thought they were dealing with a crashed plane. That's what they thought it was. And then, of course, they made the discovery of this other object. So they placed the UFO on a flatbed truck along with the wreckage from the airplane, and they were headed back to base, and then something really strange happened. All of the Mexican soldiers just dropped dead in the desert. Some of them were halfway out of their jeeps and other military vehicles. Some were lying on the desert floor. And nobody knew what the heck had happened. The U.S. was monitoring the situation. Its team was ready to go in, and that's what happened next. The Mexican soldiers, approximately 24 of them, succumbed to an unknown toxic substance, probably something that emanated from the crashed UFO. We don't know if it was radiological, chemical, biological, but something caused the convoy to come to a stop in the desert, killing all of the soldiers within 1 hour of being exposed. They were all dead. Another posting from this anonymous person on Wikipedia identifies some of the names of those Mexican soldiers. And this is what the posting said. A short distance from the wreckage was an olive green Jeep belonging to the Mexican military and containing the bodies of 4 Mexican soldiers. The soldiers were Captain Rogelio Arguelles Gonzalez, and then it has what looks like a Mexican military serial number. We're trying to track this down with the help of our colleagues in the Mexican UFO research community. Sergeant Teofilo Margarito Puebla, Corporal Jose Trinidad Meraz, and Corporal Ricardo Velasquez. Their bodies displayed signs of death by asphyxiation. There's a tie-in to Aliens in the Forest, where Mr. Shrum was apparently, they were trying to asphyxiate him when he encountered those strange beings in the forest. They were also in possession of their firearms, but showed no evidence of having attempted to use them. So once again, this is unconfirmed, but it's interesting that there was a lot of publicity about Mexico's Roswell case with the UFO Festival in Presidio coming up, and suddenly these appear on Wikipedia. So the Mexican soldiers, died. We don't know exactly why. And apparently there was a fear that what had killed the Mexican soldiers might spread into the Texas border area, which was only about 20 miles away from where this happened. So we think that this was probably the major motivation for the U.S. rescue team, rescue in quotation marks, being called in and they flew their helicopters down the U.S. border on the Texas side until they got to Candelaria, Texas, which is basically a one traffic light, one cantina little town in just north of Presidio. And it was there in Candelaria, supposedly, that they crossed over into Mexico. They had at their disposal 3 Hueys and a large cargo helicopter, twin rotor, we think. And once again, this shows the satellite view. Sorry that isn't very clear. My good friend Brad Newton from Presidio took these photographs while flying in that plane, right?
Risking life and limb just for you.
Right. So what I did is I took 2 of the photographs he took and kind of blended them together so you can see the El Llano area here and where the incident happened. And here's another view. Very rugged area. There's no population to speak of out there. So arriving at the scene at about 5 p.m. the following day, wearing biohazard suits, the Americans arrived from Fort Bliss on the helicopters. So according to the story, the soldiers took over the UFO. They attached it using cables to the cargo helicopter, and they took it away back into Texas. The soldiers that were left behind, the soldiers that had come in on the Hueys, they assembled all the remaining wreckage, including the parts of the small plane, the bodies and everything, and they exploded it. They exploded all the remaining evidence using either some kind of very high-grade explosive or a low-yield thermonuclear device, such as a suitcase nuke. And so the UFO was removed and the explosion ensued. Now what I talked about the new witnesses. When we announced that the UFO conference was happening in Presidio, and I was working with Brad Newton and Charlie Angel and several other folks in the area to organize it and to plan for it, we had suddenly come forward some residents of the Ruidosa Candelaria area in 1974, which is Mrs. Johnny Chambers, a longtime teacher, taught for about 40 years, very well respected, has been honored by the state of Texas for her service as a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse for many years. She's well known. If you mention the name Mrs. Chambers, you know, everybody in that area knows her, and her son John. So she came forward when she heard about the UFO festival, and she said she saw that big explosion right across from Candelaria on the Mexican side in 1974. And this is what she told us. It was just a big explosion in the sky, mostly round. I can see it in my mind, but it's hard to describe. I would say the width of it was about 4 or 5 miles. And of course, it was up pretty high in the sky. And her son said, all of a sudden, a big old globe, fireball-looking thing appeared over the mountain over there. We stopped and watched it for a while. It was quite a fireball. By the way, it made quite an impression on him. He was only 10 years old in 1974. So here's Presidio down here. Here is Ruidosa. Here's Candelaria, and this is where the Chambers, Mr. Chambers, Mrs. Chambers, and her son John were coming down the mountain, and their car was kind of pointed toward Mexico, and this is the area where they saw the explosion. And what's so interesting is we had this Mexico's Roswell case, and we had witnesses from the Mexican side, but we had never had a witness from the Texas side. They had never heard about it. And when they heard that the UFO festival was going to happen in Presidio and that it was kind of inspired by the Mexico's Roswell case, suddenly they made the connections in their mind, and they told us, we saw that. We saw that in 1974. So here's the mountain range that runs right along the Rio Grande River. Here's where the witnesses were standing and looking this way. They saw a 4.5 mile wide fireball over the mountains in Mexico. And this is, again, courtesy of Brad. He went down there to the place where they were standing on that day, looking into Mexico, and he took this picture.
John was with me.
And John Chambers, who was one of the witnesses, pointed out to him exactly where he saw the explosion rising up over these mountains. So what I did was I played around with Photoshop. Anybody ever done that? It's fun to play with. I put an explosion from one of the nuclear tests that the U.S. did in the 50s or 60s, and I photoshopped it in with the actual mountain range in the background. And I'll never forget, on the day of the UFO conference in Presidio, we showed this picture to Mrs. Chambers, and her mouth dropped open, and she pointed it, and she said, "That's exactly what I saw. How did you get that?" And so I explained to her what I had done, and she thought that it was remarkable, that we were able, and I did it strictly based on what they were describing. The only thing I should mention is that their sighting of this was at night, so they didn't see so much the clouds that you could see in this daytime nuclear test, but rather they saw the glow of it, as John will explain in a minute. We watched it all the way down the mountain, I imagine at least 5 or maybe 10 minutes more. We didn't keep driving at a regular speed, we slowed down and kept watching it. And then he describes a little bit about the colors: blazing red, fire red, had a little orange in it. But what I want to do is show you an interview that we just did with John Chambers 2 weeks ago when we were at the UFO festival. And Brad set this up for us. We went out to the place where you can see the mountains in the background, and John is talking. Now, I want to just caution you that it was a very windy day, and the camera was picking up a lot of wind noise, and I apologize for that. But I think you'll get the general gist of what he told us that day. Let's see if I can find that. Let's see, just a minute here. Okay, I'm going to hook up my USB drive. Give me just a minute here. The wonders of technology. Here we go. Are you okay?
Oh, yeah.
So John, tell me, show us exactly what direction you saw this strange sight, and also describe it for us.
Well, my mom and I were driving down here in cars, and at that time they drove for a coming down around the back here is when we first saw a glow coming up. It happened, the sun was going down. It had gone down. And I actually mentioned to my mom, I go, "Well, the sun's coming back up." I thought the earth had reversed polarity or something. He goes, "No, that's a fire." She goes, "No, that's a big fire." And it was over this whole mountain right here. It was a real distinct fire because it had different colors going all the way up. You had purple to blue to red and yellow and orange coming up.
And you had like one color layer, and then a different color layer on top of that.
But we couldn't see the clouds. That's why I'm pretty sure what happened in the music going on because we couldn't see the clouds. It was finally gone down so that it wasn't reflecting light through the clouds. We wouldn't see the clouds and we were just like this picture. Great. It probably was like that. We didn't know it. And my picture, it was really cool.
They didn't stay out there for a pause it there. I think, you know, basically what John is, he was describing the colors in it, and he, you know, that is it. He said that it was spread out over that whole mountain that you see there in the background. So it was really a neat experience for Brad and the rest of us who were there, listening to John describe exactly what he saw on that day when this incredible sight filled the sky in front of him. So let me go back to the PowerPoint. So now here's some interesting descriptions that John and his mom both said. They said that at first they thought it was a fire, and they had seen fires in the area before, but this was a different kind of glow. And you notice that he said it had colors layered upon colors. It was different from just a fire glow or anything like that. It was kind of like the sun going down, except the sun had already gone down. So it was almost like the sun coming back up. Well, what's interesting to me is I've read a lot of books about the atomic testing that we did in the 50s and 60s. And one of the most common descriptions of the fireball going up is witnesses described it as the sun coming up, the sun coming back up. Sometimes there was language used like there were 2 sunrises that day to describe the impact of the nuclear explosion. So to us, it is evident that what Mrs. Chambers and her son saw in 1974 looking into the mountains of Mexico is they saw the explosion that was set off to cauterize or sanitize the area of this UFO incident. It seemed to be on the other side of the mountain, and it came up over the top of the mountain, according to Mrs. Chambers. So, let me just pull the sound cable out here. Okay. So, after the recovery, the U.S. team came back across the Rio Grande River near Candelaria before continuing east. Now, here's another thing that just shocked us when we talked to John. He said that within a day after he saw the strange glow in the sky, it could have been the same day, several area residents observed a group of military helicopters moving back into the U.S. from Mexico, including one large twin-rotor helicopter. It was several, maybe 3 or 4, he said. So now we have the other important piece of the eyewitnesses on the Texas side. For the first time, somebody that saw the military aircraft coming back from Mexico. People up at Candelaria said they saw them. In those days, there just wasn't a whole lot of flying going on. They said they saw these helicopters. I don't think they were real close to the town because some of the people lived on ranches away from town. And that actually is corroborated in the story, which supposedly the crossover into Mexico and the return from Mexico occurred north of Candelaria. So they did see our military helicopters coming back out of Mexico. It was somewhere in that same time frame as the sighting of the fireball, like maybe the next day, or it could have been that same day. So just to kind of wrap up what happened after the recovery, the U.S. team is supposedly moved the disc, which had been taken out in that cargo helicopter, to the Davis Mountains. There's actually a lot of federal land in the Davis Mountains, right around the McDonald Observatory. There are federal lands owned by the U.S. government. So supposedly the U.S. team moved the disc there where they hid it overnight, and then it was picked up by a truck convoy which drove it first to Atlanta, we think to the Centers for Disease Control, which was the world's leading laboratory in the 70s for analyzing biological hazards, and obviously there was something that caused the death of all those soldiers that could be analyzed there. And then eventually, of course, it was moved elsewhere to a location that is unknown to us. So as I mentioned previously, we've been down, and I just wanted to show you that Coyame actually consists of this whole big municipio here. Right here is where it comes real close to the Texas border. And then that's, you know, where the incident happened. In this huge amount of land, there's only 1,403 people. So even though it's 5,000 square miles, very sparsely populated. So just to give you some of the imagery that's out there. And that basically gives you the gist of the story. We've been down there. We investigated several interesting sites. We recovered some wreckage from a crashed plane that we showed on the History Channel's UFO Hunters show. We don't know if that was the actual plane, although it is a plane. It's been verified to have been a plane from the era of the 1970s. We don't know if it is the actual plane. When the pieces from that were submitted by the History Channel to a lab in California for analysis, they found trace materials on it that could not be identified by the spectrographic equipment that they used. You know, the basic elements, the basic materials were all known Earth elements, but there was some other stuff in there that could not be identified. So we don't know if the crashed remains of the plane that we found in the desert in Coyame is the actual plane that crashed with the UFO. That has not, you know, it's impossible for us to say. We don't have anything linking that precisely, but it was interesting to find in approximately the place where we thought it should be, we found the wreckage of this plane. I'm going to have Brad come up and talk a little bit about the experience we had with the Presidio UFO Festival, Brad, and then we'll probably have time for just a few questions, and then we've got to clear the way for supper. Brad Newton from the city of Presidio.
Hello, thank you. Pleasure to be in Laredo. You know, I found Noe by accident. I'd heard a rumor last spring about a UFO festival, or not a UFO festival, but a UFO crash over in across the river from us. And so I got on the internet, as we all do, and looked up UFO Presidio in 1974. And that's how I found Noe. And I emailed him, and he emailed me right back, and that was the birth of the Border Zone International UFO Festival. And there seems to be a real coincidence that there's all these crashes along the border, so we called it Border Zone. I was very happy with the first year's attendance. You know, it was in the San Antonio paper where back in 1995, Roswell had this crazy idea about having a festival, and they had about 200 people show up. So we did every bit as good as that, and of course we've got a great story here that's we're just starting to get to I guess the meat of the witnesses that are out there, obviously, like the chambers, that because we had this festival that said, hey, we saw something, and we've kind of put two and two together, and they have too, and the next thing that we're looking for is some of the people that lived in the Ruidosa, Candelaria area that saw the helicopters. We know that they're out there, but you know, as time goes by, people move off and everything. So as you discuss this with folks, networking is everything, and who knows? These people have moved to you know, the four winds, and you may know one of them. So if you do run across somebody and say, hey, I grew up there, or I lived there, and they recall anything about this, the helicopters coming out, we'd love to talk to them.
We had a fellow come up saying that he had been in the studio earlier today. So.
Yeah. So anyway, just a little bit about the Big Bend area. How many of y'all ever been to the Big Bend? Okay, well there's it's time for y'all to come back. And of course, bring these other folks with you. The Big Bend is a wonderful place. It is a destination. You got to be going there to get there. And but it's well worth the trip. We have you know, the Rio Grande and 3 major canyons that you can do a float trip through. We have the Big Bend Ranch State Park. It's over 400 square miles where you can camp out and not hear the guy next to you snore. Or the kids partying. You know, the campsites are spread way out. And it takes a little while to get there. Whenever you leave the pavement, it takes an hour and a half to get to the headquarters. Like I say, it's 400 square miles, and you can certainly see the night skies as the Lord intended to be without a lot of light pollutions. So, like I say, it's just a great place to go. And this time of year, from about October through, I would say, April, there's near perfect weather. So wintertime camping is very nice. During the springtime, starting about March, we have the giant variety of bluebonnets that bloom down there. You know, y'all, in most of Texas, the bluebonnets are about this tall. Down in the Big Bend, they're this tall. And so that's really something to see. Once again, about the park, they have a lot of mountain biking trails. You can take Jeep trips, and there's plenty of outfitters down there. My card's out at the table, as well as some T-shirts, and on the back of it, we have our website, UFOBorderZone.com, and there is a ton of material that it would take all day for us to sit here and tell you what all's on there. A lot of the videos that Noe and Ruben shot on their investigations are on there, along with a lot of archive stuff, so you can really dig deep into this website, see the History Channel stuff on there, and a whole lot more, newspaper articles, there are radio interviews of what all happened. And one of the things I'm most proud of, and thanks to Jerry Pippin and Norrie's show, and George Norrie, and all the rest of them, is we got a lot of great publicity for the Presidio and the Big Bend area through these shows, and had over 500,000 listeners. So that is huge for any city. And we really appreciate Noe and Ruben and all y'all's efforts. Thank you very much. And you know, it's kind of funny the way you make friends. I just happened to come in on a UFO. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, guys. Does anyone have questions about the Mexico Roswell case? We have time for just a couple. Yes, sir.
A two-part question real quick. A lot of the description of what happened, what are the sources of those? You know, the American government, the U.S. government didn't give me any of that. It all come from Mexico. The second part is Mexican government. What is its play in this, and where are the records from that?
Okay, the first part of your question, where did this come from? It came from a leaked U.S. government document. Someone in the intelligence community put it out on an old BBS network in the early 1990s. This was before internet, folks. We used to use dial-up modems, and you'd hear the screeching sound, and you'd connect, and you'd be going at, you know, a blazing 56 kilobits per second. So anyway, they posted information that was apparently leaked. Now, these folks who have access to these classified documents, they can't take anything with them at the end of the day when their shift ends. So when they get home, they have to write it down from memory. So we have documents about this case that were taken out and then were posted to the BBS service, which was a precursor of the internet, under the code name DENEB, D-E-N-E-B. Now, for those of you who know your astronomy, Deneb is a very famous star, one of the brightest stars that we can see from Earth. And the group that was working on these UFO investigations from within the U.S. government, according to MIT graduate and longtime UFO advocate Elaine Douglas, it was a group of individuals within the U.S. government who saw this information cross their desks, and they couldn't take any of the documents with them or risk being imprisoned forever or possibly shot, but they could take it with them in their minds. The second part of your question is, we know from the witnesses that we've talked to both on the Mexican side and the U.S. that something significant did happen in this area at this time. There were witnesses on the Mexican side, ranchers who saw and felt explosion. And we heard from the chambers, several people on the U.S. side who witnessed it. So we had this leaked document, and then we have some witnesses who say something went down, there was military activity, there were helicopters coming back from Mexico back to the U.S. So we're kind of putting the pieces together. Was that?
But the Mexican government didn't play.
Okay, the Mexican government is the third part of this. We've been working with our UFO research colleagues in Mexico. Ruben is the liaison between MUFON, a Mutual UFO Network, and the organizations in Mexico that do research on UFOs. So we've been working with them since 2006. And we don't know if perhaps one of them may have put that information into Wikipedia. We're still trying to figure that out. But what they tell us is that we think that the U.S. government, like Stanton Friedman was saying earlier, the U.S. government does not release detailed information if somebody gets killed in an encounter with a UFO, a pilot is killed. The families are just told that there was an accident or a training mission. They're not given the specifics. Well, the same thing in Mexico, it's even more so, that the families of the soldiers who died out in the desert probably were just told, most of them come from poor, low-income families in the southern part of Mexico. They were probably just told that the soldiers had died in a training accident somewhere, and they were not given any details. However, the UFO researchers in Mexico are still digging into that, especially now that we have some names and what appear to be Mexican military serial numbers. We're hoping, which we've only known for about 2 months, we're hoping that Gilberto Rivera from Chihuahua and some of the other researchers from Mexico can get us some information. They know some of the former military officers who were working in the Mexican military in the 70s, so we're hopeful. One more question. Yes, ma'am.
And the pilot? What happened with the pilot of the plane?
All of the information about the small plane has been expunged from all records. We don't know, if this was deliberate or if it was lost over time. Because as I mentioned, this case did not come to light until 20-some years after it happened. 20 years or so. So the only thing we know is that it was a small plane, like something like a Cessna, and that it was of Mexican registry. We don't know if there was anything other than just the pilot, if he could have had occupants. The Mexican UFO researchers say that there's a possibility the plane and its occupants were involved in some kind of illegal activity, and so they were kind of trying to fly low under the radar, so to speak, and not draw too much attention to themselves. This was in the era before 9/11. There wasn't as much focus on air traffic going back and forth between the border of U.S. and Mexico. And do we have time for one more question?
Yes, go right ahead.
One last question. Anyone? Over here. Yes, ma'am.
Earlier you mentioned that the remains of the crash site and the Mexican military officials were quarantined for protection, and I just wanted to know whose protection exactly.
What happened with the Mexicans is the Mexican military in 1974, and I don't think even today, is prepared to handle what goes on at one of these sites. I mean, we have had former soldiers who are now retired who took part in crash retrieval scenarios such as this. When you enter a scenario like this, there's a possibility of radiation, there's a possibility of exposure to some kind of toxic, biohazards of all kinds. And the Mexican military did not have the technology to protect themselves from that. They went out to the scene in the desert thinking they had a small plane crash and they were just going to deal with that. It wasn't until later that they discovered, hey, there's something more to this. And when the U.S. arrived, they were in fully equipped hazmat gear. They had all the protection. This was a team of specialists who are on call for emergencies such as this. And that was the difference between the two. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience. Unfortunately, I am sold out of the book Mexico's Roswell. I have other of my books up at the table at the front, and you can get Mexico's Roswell from my Amazon authors page, amazon.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Torres. And Brad will be visiting Presidio once again.
October 20,